Now, the topic for today is measurement of variables operational definition. Now, if we are to conduct a research and if we are evaluating influence of one variable on another variable, we need to measure that variable. And unless or until we measure it properly, we cannot have proper results that are reliable, results that are valid, and results that we can obviously conclude and base our decisions on. Now, the contents for today is explain how variables are measured, explain when operationalization of variables is necessary, and operationally define or operationalize abstract and subjective variables. And we are going to look into an example of how to operationalize as well. Now, measurement of the variable is an integral part of research. Failure to do so, obviously, you cannot conduct a research because what you are interested in is evaluating the impact of one variable on another. So, if you cannot measure a variable properly, you cannot assess its impact. Now, unless the variables are measured in some way, we will not be able to find answers to our research question. For example, my research question is that I want to assess the impact of corporate social responsibility on organizational performance. So I have to have a way to measure corporate social responsibility. I have to have a way to measure organizational performance. Normally, we can measure the organizational performance by return on assets, return on equity, and there are other ways to do it as well. These are objective ways, there are subjective ways to do it as well. In this session, we will discuss how variables lend themselves to measurement. Now, how variables are measured? To test the hypothesis that workforce diversity affects organizational effectiveness, we have to measure workforce diversity and organizational effectiveness as given in the previous example. For instance, if we want to measure the impact of corporate social responsibility on organizational performance. Another example could be if we want to measure the impact of transformational or transactional leadership on project success. So we have to measure both of these variables. Now, what measurement entails is that measurement is the assignment of numbers or other symbols to characteristics or attributes of objects according to a pre-specified set of rules. Now what you do is you are actually associating numbers or symbols to characteristics or attributes of objects. Now what are these objects? Objects include persons, strategic business units, companies, countries, bicycles, elephants, kitchen, appliances, anything, restaurants, shampoo, yogurt, so on. Anything could be an object. Anything that has got attributes, anything that has got characteristics. Now, example of the characteristics of the objects are achievement motivation, which is common in human beings. Organizational effectiveness. This is for the organization, an attribute or characteristic of an organization. Shopping enjoyment. Obviously, this is relevant to human beings. Length, weight, ethnic diversity, service quality, conditioning effects, and taste. So these are, what are these? These are characteristics that describe a particular object. It is important that you realize that you cannot measure objects. This is very important. Sometimes students are coming to us and saying that we are evaluating the impact of, let's say, pay on employees. And my instant question is, employee what? Employee satisfaction, employee motivation, employee commitment, employee discretionary behavior, or any other characteristic of employee. So you cannot measure object by itself. What you are doing is you are measuring the characteristics or attributes of the object. You cannot say the impact of corporate social responsibility on organization. Now, organization what? Organizational effectiveness or performance or productivity. In similar fashion, you can measure the length, the attribute of a person, the object. Now, length is the attribute of a person, which is the object. The weight of an elephant. So weight is an attribute, elephant is the object. The shopping enjoyment of the woman. So woman is an object, shopping enjoyment is the attribute. Service quality of the restaurant. So restaurant is an object and service quality is its attribute. To be able to measure, you need an object and attributes of the object. but you also need a judge who will say that, okay, yes, these are the attributes and this is how they are. So you need someone to rate those attributes as well. So for measurement, you need two things: object, and you need to define its attributes. You need to define its characteristics. Now, a judge is someone who has necessary knowledge and skills to assess the quality of something, such as the taste of yogurt, the arousal-seeking tendency of stockbrokers, or the communication skills of the students, or the service quality of the university, or social responsibility of an organization, or human resource practices within an organization. So these, as who will be the judge? Someone who is directly affected by the object, or someone who is the consumer of the particular object, or customer of the particular object, or who may be serving in that particular object. In many cases, the object and the judge are the same. For instance, if you want to measure the gender, the attribute of your employees, the objects, or the shopping enjoyment, which is the attribute of woman, that is the object, you can simply ask the objects, employees and women respectively, to provide you with necessary details via a self-administered question. So for example, if I was to judge the service quality of a restaurant, so who is the best judge to provide me with the answer? Someone who has eaten at that particular restaurant. If I want to judge the service quality of a university, who is the best judge to provide that information? Obviously someone who has studied at that particular university. However, it is unlikely that the object has necessary knowledge and skills to act as a judge when you want to measure the taste, the attribute of the yogurt, the service quality of a restaurant, the communication skills of the students, or even the managerial expertise of the supervisors. Now, there might be a case that it is unlikely that the object has necessary knowledge and skills to act as a judge. For example, there might be a situation when you cannot act as a judge. Now, it is important to note that the yogurt actually can't judge its own taste, so it can't be a self-judge. Or the restaurant can't judge its own service quality, so the consumer has to be the judge. Or the communication skills of student. Now, a student can't judge his own communication skill. It has to be judged by someone else, or even the managerial expertise of the supervisors. So in this case, the object cannot be the judge of its own attributes or characteristics. Now, attributes of objects can be physically measured by some calibrated instrument, pose no measurement problem. Okay, now there are objects whose attributes, whose characteristics can be easily measured and you won't have any problem whatsoever. For example, length of a table, for instance, age, for instance, marital status, for instance, how long have someone been working in an organization, your current semester, your job rank, your monthly salary. These are something that are really easy to measure. Like demographic variables, what we normally see at the top of a questionnaire. These are things that are very easy to measure. But there are certain more abstract or subjective attributes, and that is very difficult to measure. For instance, it is relatively difficult to measure the level of achievement motivation of office clerks, the shopping enjoyment of women, or the need for social responsibility within the companies, or the leadership attributes, or the human resource practices, for example, or the turnover intention. These are so subjective phenomena, or even service quality. These are very subjective and qualitative phenomena. These are abstract, and these concepts actually change from object to object, and for the object that you are measuring these particular concepts. Likewise, it is not straightforward to test hypotheses on the relationship between workforce diversity, managerial expertise, and organizational effectiveness. The problem is that we cannot simply ask this question, okay, how diverse is your company's workforce? This is not how it works. We need to measure it. If you ask a person who is obviously from a different ethnic background and has had a good experience of the organization, he will obviously say, well, yes, it's a very diverse company. But another person who is from a different ethnic background might say altogether a different thing. So your measure won't be reliable. So how effective is your organization, or how well the organization is performing? These are very abstract phenomena. So you need to properly measure these concepts. How do you properly measure these concepts? We are going to discuss today. Now, the first thing that you want to do is, or you should do, is your operational definition or operationalization. Despite the lack of physical measuring devices to measure the more nebulous or vague variable, something that is ill-defined. So nebulous means vague or ill-defined. There are ways of tapping these types of variables. Obviously, a variable might be nebulous, vague, ill-defined, not clear, but obviously you can measure it. You can have ways to measure a particular variable that is vague. One technique is to reduce the abstract notions or concepts to observable behaviors and or characteristics. This is what we normally do. The first thing, or an important technique that is most of the times used, is that you divide your abstract notion or the concept or the variable into observable characteristics. For example, how would you say a leader is effective? So effective leadership can be an abstract phenomena. But how would you say that leader is effective? Because he is trustworthy. This is, now you are dividing that leadership into observable characteristics. He is trustworthy. He does not lie. He focuses on the development of people. He is humble. He promotes initiation. He builds relationships. So these are now observable characteristics of a leader. In other words, the abstract notions are broken down into observable behavior or characteristics, something that we see in a leader, something that is visible in his behavior. For instance, another example, the concept of quality is very abstract. We cannot see it. However, we would expect quality of a product defined as something that is acceptable by the consumer. Now, how would you define quality? It is how or whether it is acceptable to the consumers of the product or service, in terms of the nature of the product or the service received. Quality of a product like mobile would, and then the problem is, because that's why it's very vague or nebulous, that the quality of the product or quality would be different in terms of, like, if you want to define the quality in a restaurant, that would be significantly different pertinent to quality of a product like mobile. Operationalizing is done by looking at the behavioral dimension that we have already discussed, facets or properties denoted by the concepts. So what is observable pertinent to a leader? That was one example. Now these are then translated into observable and measurable elements. So for example, you say that a leader is humble. So what you do is you create a statement out of it and add a Likert scale to it so that you can measure it, so that you can measure the response of the people. So you can add or associate a number to that particular characteristic or attribute. For instance, I want to measure leadership effectiveness. So my first question is, my leader is humble. Now this is not measurable unless or until you associate a proper scale with it, so that people can associate a number or rating with this particular attribute. This will make it measurable. Now whenever you are deciding on these measurements, the most important thing is, whenever you are discussing a concept or dealing with a concept in your study, whenever you are looking into the operational definition or operationalization of a concept, the first thing that you need to do is you need to define that particular concept in your study. The definition of quality for a mobile or a study that is looking into the quality of mobiles is very different to the definition of quality when you are studying a restaurant or in hospitality. So you need to define the concept first, and then based on that definition you select your measures. Based on that definition you select the characteristics and attributes. For example, if you are studying social responsibility in a university, you cannot take economic dimension or profitability as a attribute of the university. Operationalization, dimension and elements. Now there are two types of scales or dimensionality of the scale. Some are unidimensional and some are multidimensional. Unidimensional constructs, that they have one main component or dimension. They do not have sub components. For example, let's say we have got this paper right here. Now this is service quality in higher education. Now this is a multi-dimensional construct. How? Because it has got multiple dimensions. For example, teacher quality is one dimension, administrative services is another dimension, knowledge services is another dimension, activities is another dimension, continuous improvement, leadership quality, and others. These are different dimensions. Now there could be a variable that has got no dimensions, like it is unidimensional. You cannot divide into different categories. Let's say we've got this paper here. Okay, in this particular case, this is a study on corporate social responsibility and customer loyalty in hotel industry, a cross-country study. Now if you look at this here, this table here, now this table here actually explains, for example, this is service quality, the construct that you want to measure, and these are the observable characteristics, attributes of service quality. Now service quality in this case is measured using 5 items. There are no dimensions in it, there are no subcategories of service quality. But in this case here, service quality in higher education had sub-dimensions. So this is the difference between multidimensional and unidimensional scale. Now obviously it's up to you, and depending on the study that you are doing, depending on the product or service or the context or the study setting, you can have either multidimensional or unidimensional scales. Now the items are needed to measure the variable. These items are needed because if we use fewer items, now obviously if you are measuring a particular concept and you are using a particular scale, you have to use it in totality. You cannot just go and remove items on your own, because that's already reliable and validated scale. Sometimes what students do is they keep on removing items. Okay, this might not be important, this might not be important. That is your subjective opinion. You cannot use your subjective opinion to obviously divide or remove items from an established scale that is reliable and valid. So in this case, if you are using this scale, you have to use it in totality, and once you have got the data, then only you can remove the items. Or in this case, we used 5 items for service quality or 8 items for corporate social responsibility, and noted that okay, these are taken, these variables, as unidimensional. We did not remove any items before the analysis, because if we do, we may be hurting its content validity. We are maybe making it non-measurable. It may not be now the represented or representative set of items for that particular construct. Now operationalizing the multidimensional concept of this is one example of operationalizing a concept called achievement motivation, and its example is available in Uma Sakran's book. Now suppose that we are interested in establishing a relationship between gender and achievement motivation. For example, you are looking to assess how gender affects achievement motivation, or is gender affected by achievement motivation. Another way to describe it, whether achievement motivation differs between male and female respondents. Now, to test this relationship, we'll have to measure both gender and achievement motivation. By measure here means that whenever you are asking someone to fill a particular questionnaire, you will have to ask for their gender as well. And obviously you will have to ask for the questions pertinent to achievement motivation. Now at this point you will probably understand that whereas measuring gender will not cause any problem, you just have to ask them, or you can just, or even if you mark it your own, or if you have distributed a questionnaire without being there in person, you can just mention okay, gender, and they will write male or female. Measuring achievement motivation probably will cause much more problem because it is subjective in nature. For this reason, we must infer achievement motivation by measuring behavioral dimensions. Now, for this, we need to measure the achievement motivation by measuring its behavioral dimensions, its facets, its characteristics, its attributes. Indeed, without measuring these dimension, facets, or characteristics, we will not be able to arrive at the bottom line statements. So what we need to do is we need to explain achievement motivation. We need to identify its dimension, characteristics, attributes, facets, factors, whatever you want to call it. And once you do that, then only you will be able to identify or arrive at its bottom line statements. Now, the next step is measuring abstract concepts such as achievement motivation is to go through the literature to find out, now how do you measure this particular construct? In this case, achievement motivation, you have to go to the literature. You have to go to the scale handbooks, like Taking Measure to Work is a book, very good book, or scientific journals that have already measured these concepts. For example, if I am interested in perceptions of service quality, now where do I find the scale for measuring perceptions of service quality? If I go into the literature, I might find this particular paper that has developed a whole scale on measuring service quality in higher education. Or maybe I can go into another paper. If I'm interested in measuring team effectiveness, I might find this particular paper that has measured team effectiveness. For instance, there could be another example. If I'm interested in measuring servant leadership in higher education, I have to go to the literature and I might find this paper. So the scales are already available in the literature. You just have to search. If they are not available, then there is a way to do it, and we'll be discussing that as well. So here the scale is available. You just need to copy it and make changes if you want, if they are required in your study. Obviously you can change these statements to suit your study settings. Here are the statements, just copy and paste it, just give the reference of this paper and use it. Now, or there is a book. Now this is an example of how achievement motivation is measured. The C here means construct, because we are studying the construct achievement motivation, a building block of our research. Now D here means dimensions, so it is a multi-dimensional construct which has 5 dimensions: driven by work, unable to relax, impatience with ineffectiveness, seeking moderate challenge, seeks feedback. Now what is this E? These are the elements that later become the items for that particular dimension. Now, for example, driven by work has one element constantly working. Now this particular characteristic or this particular attribute of achievement motivation is later transformed into a particular statement, like I like to constantly work, or the employees within the organization like to work constantly. But because it is achievement motivation of a particular person, you can say that, okay, I like to work constantly. I am very reluctant to take time off for anything. So these elements are then used to form particular statements. Look at this. Now look at this. Now this particular, in this case, the items came from the literature as well and from the interviews as well. So when you are developing a scale, your items might come from existing literature and interviews. In this case, how do you define a construct, how do you define a dimension, and how do you define the element? Now the construct is servant leadership, because we are focusing on servant leadership scale in Spanish higher education. Now what are the dimensions? Here are the dimensions. Behaving ethically is a dimension, development is a dimension, emotional healing is a dimension, empowerment is a dimension, relationship building is a dimension. Now what are the elements? These are the elements. These items, these statements are the elements. Now in this example, the elements were keywords. In this case, those keywords were obviously transferred into proper statements. Another example, let's say this one. The construct is service quality in higher education. The dimensions are these: factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, factor 4, factor 5, and factor 6. Now what are the elements? These are the elements. Now in this case, in this particular study, what happened was that interviews were conducted, keywords were identified. Those keywords are actually elements. Those keywords were later grouped into different dimensions, and then Obviously statistical tests were performed, so that comes later. So this is how you can use or you can define your constructs in a study. Now let's for instance take an example. Let's say we want to define dimensions and elements of service quality. So how do you develop your own scale if it's not available in the literature? How do you operationalize your own scale? So there are two things that you should do. If you can't find the scale in the literature, what you should do is you should find the definition or conceptualization of that particular scale. The next thing that you should do is you go for the experts in that particular area and ask them for what they think about that particular concept and what they think are the key attributes and characteristics of that particular concept. Now once you have all these things from the literature and from the interviews, the next thing is you need to group them. For instance, let's say we want to identify the dimensions and elements of service quality in higher education. Let's say we change it to in higher education. Okay, now let's say we want to measure the service quality in higher education and we can't find a scale for it. So what we can do is we go to the literature, but there will be something on service quality in higher education in the literature. There might be a few definitions, there might be a few suggestions as to this is how service quality in higher education must look. There might be certain key attributes or certain characteristics. Let's say we found that, okay, audit of teacher performance. Let's say cordial relationship with teacher. Let's say respect from administration. Let's say easy schedule. Let's say easy to understand teachers. Let's say teachers well trained. Let's say meritorious system. Smooth processes. Staff well trained to deal with student issues. Lab facilities. Transport facilities. Or let's say lab facility, transport facility, sports and recreation facilities. Let's say we after the interviews and going through the literature, we found these 12 things to be significantly important. Obviously there would be other, but just for the sake of example, now these are actually the elements, attributes of service quality. But if we go through these, we can see that okay, there could be certain dimensions in here. This is related to teacher. Now the second one, this is related to teacher, but this one is related to administration. This is obviously administrative issue, but this is related to teacher. So let's say I copy this from here to, or cut it and paste it there. This is administration. Now this is again teacher. So I see there is a certain dimensionality in service quality. Now if I see these 4 items, we can say this is pertinent to teacher quality. These 5 items related to administrative quality. These 3 items related to the quality of facilities. So what is this? Now this is obviously, let's say this, let's say this, these are three different dimensions. Okay, this is too dark. Let's put it like this. Oh, sorry. And this one here, let's say, now these are three dimensions that are emerging from this particular scale, or for this particular scale. Now if you do not have a scale, you can just develop it like this. Obviously your definition is particularly important, because if you follow a definition that is totally different to what you are measuring, obviously that is wrong. So once you define, you can follow that direction and then obviously define the elements of that particular scale and dimensions based on that particular definition. I hope now you are well clear about the concepts of operationalization and dimensionality and elements. Thank you very much.